It's The Journey with drug and alcohol attorney Mark G. Astor.
All right, welcome everybody to another edition of The Journey. Super excited to have as my guest Matt Mossberg. Welcome to the show, Matt.
Thank you. Very great to be here.
Matt is going to be a very special guest. He's a former member of the Maryland State Legislature, also ran for United States Congress. He's in recovery and now works for a not-for-profit trying to spread the word and help a lot of people. Yeah. And we got connected by our mutual friend John Hewlett.
Correct.
Who's another just amazing individual who has really had a tremendous influence on me, not just personally, but especially professionally. And I know he's really well respected. And so I was flattered when you said you'd come in here. So
John's an amazing guy.
He really is. So it's so good to meet you.
You as well.
And I was flattered that you wanted to come in and tell your story. And I think before we came in here, I told you I'd look. There's a video actually. If you just sort of Google your name, there's a video. It's about 4 or 5 minutes, I think. Mm-hmm. And I was very moved. It's really moving. It's a very moving story. And as you can tell, sometimes I get choked up on my guests. I guess we all think we're tough guys, especially us men. But then
my goodness,
need somebody that that's been through. I guess had a few war wounds. It's, you realize how lucky you are. So thanks for coming in.
Right.
So let's go back in time a little bit because. So you were a member of the Maryland State Legislature. Right. When was that?
This was in the mid to late 90s.
Okay.
I was elected at the age of 27. At that time, I was the youngest member from my area ever to be elected to the state legislature. I love politics. I was a political animal. I took to it like a fish takes to water. And I loved it. I loved the experience, was able to get some amazing things done legislatively, was seen as a rising star in the state legislature. So I had the opportunity, the potential for a really great career, had it not been for the addictive nature and tendency and personalities that I was carrying around and keeping a secret, which I thought from everybody. But really, the joke in recovery is addicts can be great liars and we lie to ourselves the best. And I certainly was living in denial about that part of my life.
Did you grow up in Maryland?
I did. Grew up in Maryland, right outside of Washington, D.C., city called Rockville, so born and raised there.
Okay, what was family life like for you?
Family life was interesting. So my mother was very spiritual. She had us in church 3 times a week. I was raised in a Southern Baptist church. So my dad was a very hard worker. At that time, he had no faith inclinations. So I grew up, and he was also the product of 2 parents who were severe alcoholics. So he never touched alcohol, never did any drugs, but a lot of those tendencies that people have in families as far as living in that environment and the instability and the dysfunction was certainly carried into my parents' marriage. And for my 2 brothers and me, it was difficult. They eventually divorced. And my mom, raised a single mom raising 3 boys.
Well, couldn't have been easy.
It wasn't, and it's interesting. As I'm in recovery, I hear my story repeated by so many others. And once again, recovery affects people from all backgrounds, all shapes and sizes. But, for us, it's certainly one of those things at an early age of 14, I was looking for something to cope with my own fears and insecurities. And, the crowd I was hanging around that just happened to be, drugs. So I fell into it. I don't want to say fell into it. I walked into it at around 14, seeking that relief.
Okay, so in terms of drug use, I know we actually didn't talk about any of this stuff, so we're sort of going with the flow here.
I'm trying to surprise you.
Yeah, that's okay. I've been surprised before. Sometimes by myself, but so when we talk about drugs, what are we talking about? Marijuana?
Yeah, I started off marijuana, drinking a lot. Not so much that in the. My path towards addiction was I certainly had the predisposition for it. I was certainly trying to self-medicate, trying to cope, trying to escape. But for me, when I was, started at 14, but when I turned 16 years old, I just happened to know somebody who was a cocaine dealer. So I remember when I tried cocaine for the first time at 16, I remember that feeling of where have you been all my life? I'm going to do this until the day I die. I mean, I'd found my drug of choice, and that just... I hadn't discovered opiates yet, but it was just incredible how, just from the very first line I ever did, I was hooked, and it just took over. It was an obsession of mine, and I did anything it took to keep using it. And even at 16 years old, and the expense, this is when cocaine was about $100 a gram. So the things I did to support that habit were pretty shameful.
Okay.
But that just continued to lead to a downward spiral, where I was kicked out of school. Having all these adult problems, as drug use will do, and certainly not being mature enough to handle it. So, my life up until the time when I first did my first opiate was, this addictive tendency, this addictive personality, partying, hanging out with the wrong people, and kind of coming back. And a lot of my story too is, being raised in church, as I had a really strong foundation, a faith foundation. So, but also I was always in the middle of, God loves me, God hates me, I'm a good person, I'm a bad person, kind of this back and forth, and this, we talk about this committee in our head that goes on. And, I was just searching. I was searching.
It sounds like you were very conflicted, right? I mean, you
Right.
had this sort of spiritual, religious background on one hand. On the other hand, you had this sort of, for lack of a wild life going on.
Correct. I say it was very much like the prodigal son in the story, where I certainly, I was just looking for something. There was a hole in my heart, and I was doing everything and trying everything to fill that.
So talk about the opiates. When did that sort of become an issue?
Well, that's the interesting thing. That really didn't happen until later in my life. I was in the state legislature. I was, like I said, for that was my identity. Politics was who I was. And in 1998, I lost re-election, and that led me down a real spiral of depression, of serious depression. And so this is 98, 99, and around that time, the opioid epidemic was just really getting started. And I was in that first wave of people being prescribed opiates by several doctors without any regard to the addictive side of it.
So how long did you spend in the state legislature?
I was there for 4 years.
Okay, so and during this time, actively using?
I was mostly using some prescription drugs, but mostly drinking a lot. I was doing the acceptable thing, for a politician. So I didn't. But Mark, the whatever drug I was using, the effect was the same. It was just a way to cope and numb the pain. And the problem with me is, and this is I find a lot in addiction with myself, is I gave myself, I justified my use. I gave myself permission to do as much as I wanted, anything I wanted, and regardless of what I was doing or what position I held, I was very selfish, very self-centered, and if I wanted to drink, by all means, I had the right to do that, and I was going to do it to excess.
Right. Do you think maybe it was part of the some part of the culture? If you're politics, you're getting wined and dined, and so
that's true.
Going out for dinner and having a couple of drinks. I mean, that's just
it is
part of being a politician.
Right. And, my joke is that I'm in recovery both from addiction and from politics. I'm kind of in a dual addiction recovery program.
I've made the joke about the legal profession, too.
No, it's true. It is. But for me, once again, and this is what separates people from maybe who use or abuse, say, alcohol, which obviously is legal. With being an addict, I couldn't stop. I couldn't go out and just have 2 drinks. A lot of my friends could. A lot of people could. This whole idea of drinking responsible, I'm like, what in the world does that mean? I have no idea. But, for me, if I was drinking, it was to get drunk. If I was drinking, it was for effect. I would drink until I could not handle it anymore, till I blacked out or till I passed out. So there was no moderation, and that's really what eventually I realized that's the problem with addiction, is that it controls us. We can't stop.
Okay, so while this is all going on, you're still in politics. Tell us a bit about your family life, because I know at some point you got married.
Right.
When was that?
So I was married. I had 2 kids. And once again, just everything else that followed from that. And when I say, a lot of times people come to recovery because they have a substance use problem, an alcohol problem. For me, I had a MAT problem. Everything I did to excess. So unfortunately, whether it was the alcohol, whether it was the drugs, whether it was the womanizing, I did it all. And so, eventually that led to my family splitting apart because I was just an out-of-control addict. And this was after the legislature. But once again, just like, my story might be unique in the things I did, but I'm not special. In the rooms of recovery, I've heard my story repeated so many times where, this addiction eventually led to me losing everything. And through my addiction, I've actually lost everything twice in my life. But it's the behaviors and the patterns that I was engaged in that look, in the end, nobody wanted to be around me. I had either chased everybody away or they had left. I was just self-destructive. I really was a tornado just blowing through people's lives.
So you say you lost everything twice. Tell them
Well, so interestingly, and this is actually plays into a lot of the work that I do on a ministry level outside through Celebrate Recovery. I'd lost everything. I'd hit rock bottom, and I had returned to my faith in 2004. I'd gotten back into church, and very committed, very involved in service, but I was not working an active recovery program. My thinking was, this addiction thing, this drug use or this drinking, that's behind me. I've been fixed. I've been cured. I've been saved from it, and not realizing that a lot of the tendencies in my life, a lot of the patterns of behavior were never addressed. So I was never working a recovery program. I wasn't around other people recovering from alcohol and drug use. I didn't have that support network. So I actually was clean for 8 years. I'd remarried. And in May 11th of 2010, just really living a blessed life, I should say. Great job, great family, great work. My wife at the time and I had had a son, so everything was wonderful. I was working from home, and my wife at the time had left to pick up our son from day school. And as she was pulling out of her neighborhood, a big truck came around the corner and hit her car. And it was a devastating accident. It was right down the road from where I was working, where we were living.
Did you hear the accident?
I did not, but just a few minutes later, a neighbor came in and got me and said, "I think your wife's been in a car accident." And so when I got to the scene, the first responders had already arrived, and they were still cutting her out of the car. And I just went into immediate shock. And it was a horrible experience. I didn't know if our son was with her at the time. But that led, and I'm really condensing the story, but that led to a 2.5 year really a nightmare, I could say, where because of the injury, she suffered a brainstem injury, but because of the injury, I had to quit work, take care of our son, take care of our family, and care for her 24/7. And we did have help eventually, but after 2.5 years of that, living that just instability, in a moment, I was at home and kind of in a freak accident. I broke my leg and went back to the hospital. And the doctor's like, "We're going to give you some pain medicine." And in that instant, it's interesting. In that instant, I realized that was not a good idea because of my past. But once again, this pattern of I give myself permission. I deserve, a holiday from this mess. I deserve a break. For me, that was, I jokingly say, but seriously, I need to take a narcotics holiday. And I did. So I picked back up after 8 years of being clean and instantly relapsed. And everything all the patterns of behavior and everything before just came right back in, rushing right back in. And within 4 months, I'd lost everything, lost the family, lost, financially. I ended up living out of my car, homeless. Just once again, in a very short order, it just came crashing back. And once again, that's very common, for folks in recovery who've relapsed. And my story is no different. And it led me to a place where I was so in such a low state and so despondent that I was suicidal, and had not medical professionals stepped in my situation, I'd be dead now.
So you're, it's interesting on the video. You look at the video. There's a couple of photographs of the accident scene.
Right.
I'm amazed she even survived. I mean, it was like I think it was a Toyota or a Nissan.
It was a Toyota Yaris.
Right? I mean, the car looked to me like it was just literally torn to pieces.
Right, and to see that, and to live, and once again, for those who've ever been caregivers, for those who've ever lived through some kind of trauma, I am a lot more these days. I am so much more sympathetic, obviously, having been through it, in the effect that it has on people, the effect that it had on the family, the effect that it had on me. And I'm by no means excusing. Nobody said, "Oh, this is a terrible situation. Let me forcibly open up your mouth and throw a pill down it, a Percocet." So I voluntarily walked back into addiction. I made that decision. I justified it in my mind. So I did not excuse any of that behavior. But the the effect that things like that have on us, and for me, my coping mechanism to run back to my safety area, even though I was clean for 8 years. No, it was horrible, and just the uncertainty of, is she going to live? Is she going to die? And the care and everything. And one more thing, had I been working in an active recovery program, I probably could have made it through that situation, but I was not. I had no support network. That's why I've become such a big advocate for getting people into a recovery community.
Yeah, that's one of the things that John had educated me on. Because when I first met him, and I told him, I said, I've spent some time talking to Dave Ehrenberg, who's our terrific state attorney here,
Yes.
and I said, you know, I said, we got to make treatment available to everybody. If we threw money at this and make treatment available to everybody, I think we could really save a lot of people. And he said, you know, you're missing part of the picture here, which is, okay, let's say we get everybody into recovery, but what do we do afterwards? They need a place to live. They need employment.
Exactly.
They need a sponsor. They need access to meetings. They need a support system
Absolutely.
around them. And I said, you know, he's right. I
He's
never really
absolutely
thought
right.
about it. It's not just like, you know, because I mean, treatment's great, right? That gives us
Right.
gives somebody the opportunity to get clean.
Right.
But it's kind of like going to see the doctor. He says, take 2 of these in the morning and call me, right? Yeah, I mean, they'll take care of what the initial issue is, but if you don't take the steps after the fact,
Absolutely.
and I was like, wow, I never really thought about it, but he's right.
He's
What's the point
absolutely
of having
right.
all the treatment if you don't have all the follow-up that goes with it to keep people in recovery?
Yeah, you know, Mark, he's absolutely right. And the analogy I use to that is, if you look at treatment and recovery, this whole world, it's the treatment side is really akin to an emergency room. You know, you go there, you get the bleeding stopped, you stabilize the patient, whatever you have to do, but that's it. And that's just the first step. You know, in a long, lifelong, really. How should I say, you know, a lifelong walk, a lifelong journey of living in recovery. So with that emergency room, yes, you get them into treatment, you get them stable, so to speak, or you detox them, as you say. But what about after that? What comes after that? And I think one of the biggest mistakes that we've made in America and in addiction recovery is that, you know, we focus on the front end services, but let's not fool ourselves. Nobody going through a 28-day program has the tools necessary. The need to build that infrastructure in our lives takes time, you know, and that's why I think that first 6 to 12 months is so critical. Stable housing, being in an environment, things that, you know, John discussed with you. But for myself personally, had I not gone from my 28-day rehab into a sober house and had that time, that 6 to 12 months to build that foundation and that infrastructure, I wouldn't have made it. I would have relapsed. And that's, I think, why we see such high relapse rates of people coming out of treatment and going back in, and that's that cycle that we see.
So how long, the second time around, how long did you stay in active addiction for?
You know, it's maybe less than a year.
Okay.
And that's how quick it was, and that's how quickly things turn around. And I really mean this, and not just for you, but for the audience, is there many, you know, I say there are many cords that bind an addict. Some people just want to look at it as, oh, this is a medical problem, or this is a societal problem, or this is you know, an environmental problem for where they live. You know, there are so many factors that go into addiction. I say many are the cords that bind an addict, you know, so we just can't look at it piecemeal and say, let's take this or this side or that side and I'll fix it. It didn't. You know, for me, the things I needed, the infrastructure that I needed to build in my life had much more to do with bringing me out of isolation, you know, and bringing me into a healthy community where I had people I could relate to, where I had other people who are getting clean. And another point I want to bring up is the biggest threat to my life was not so much the addiction, that was a symptom. It was the guilt and the shame I was feeling that were so crushing and so overwhelming, from which I could not escape. And that was causing me to walk down that dangerous road
To relapse,
but also to eventually get me to a place of being suicidal, of having to go to a psychiatric ward before I went to recovery. You know, my story is that while I was homeless and suicidal and living in a homeless shelter, somebody from the health department came in and talked and sat with me and talked me through, and I didn't realize how close I was to actually doing something desperate. And I remember the lady looking at me and said, I'm going to give you a choice, one of two choices. You can either right now go to the psych ward, or we're going to get a court order and force you to go, because you are that close to doing something desperate. I couldn't even see that. And so for me, a recovery program, dealing with the things I needed, had a lot to do with, you know, dealing with that guilt and the shame of my past, of the decisions I made. So yes, there was a time where I needed to detox off the substances, but it went so far beyond that. And I think that's what we're talking about here, is that, you know, we might take care of the immediate need in treatment, but the work that comes after that, the transition into a stable long-term recovery, is absolutely essential.
Yeah, it's huge. And it's interesting because, you know, one of the things that we've really done, especially the last year, but, you know, for the 4 years we've been doing this, is really immersed ourselves in the treatment industry. And I've noticed the people that we are, I would say, I call them friends, because the people that we refer clients, I mean, they're not just people that we refer, these are friends. And,
Absolutely.
And I've noticed the folks that have the best outcome are the folks that continually work at it. I mean, even if they've been in recovery 5, 10, 15 years, they go to meetings, they have a sponsor. If they feel like they need to talk to somebody, they go and talk to somebody.
Right.
They exercise. They have healthy outlets.
Exactly.
They don't just sit there and let it consume them, because it will do.
Right.
And so, I mean, I always say that, for me, just as a non-clinician, I always to me recovery looked a bit like, you know, remission from cancer.
Right.
You know, you get a remission, but that doesn't mean say you go back to smoking, drinking, and eating McDonald's every day. You got to work at it, or you're going to relapse, right? You're going to go,
exactly.
It's going to come back, and probably worse.
Exactly.
So, I mean,
that's what happened in my case, and that's why I intentionally use that word infrastructure. I look at it as, you know, once somebody gets stable, if they come out of treatment or they, you know, they've gone through that time period of detoxing physically, you know, the physical withdrawals and getting stable. Once again, the emergency room analogy is, you know, taking a look at their lives, and I'm using this not only from personal experience, but things that have been researched and there's a lot of data on is, you know, what are the things that are in a person's life what is that infrastructure that they need to ensure the best likelihood of a stable recovery? A lot of these are objective, you know, things that we can observe and see, but for the addict, a lot of them also is internal and more subjective. We need to be addressing all of those. You know, one of the things that I learned in recovery, coming out of that isolation into a healthy community, is that as strange as this might sound to people, the key for me was I needed to be around people who could give me hope, you know, that I could look at their story, you know, and I've seen this repeatedly over and over again in the rooms of recovery. That moment that hope is born, somebody says, you know, I can get over this, I can beat this because I have this person in my life and they did it and I can relate to them. And those are things which a healthy, strong, stable recovery community can provide for people like myself. We really need those things.
Well, so when you were in the state legislature, in politics was your passion,
right?
The things that you were sort of passionate about, anything to do with the stuff we're talking about now, was totally different?
No, not at all. Completely different. Believe me, I was enjoying myself too much. I wasn't going to give myself up. You know.
Okay. So what motivated you to run for U.S. Congress?
Well, once again, you know, being in recovery, I'm convinced more and more that nothing is a coincidence. You know, and a lot of this too is, you know, really reestablishing and reaffirming my spiritual basis. And I do say recovery, and I don't apologize for it, that I needed a God that was bigger than me. You know, we talk about that in recovery as far as a power greater than ourselves restoring us to sanity. I needed that, and that came, and so that faith component was very important for me. And I prayed to be used. You know, however, you know, we joke, you know, God takes our mess and turns it into His message. So I just thought, you know, any way that I can serve or work. And so, just once again, as it turns out, by coincidence, this is about the same time I was still in Maryland. The governor of Maryland, Governor Hogan, was putting together an emergency opioid package. And a lot of the people who worked for his administration were former friends of mine from the legislature. And one I was particularly close to, and I'd not really shared my story publicly. I'd shared it in the rooms of recovery, but he you know, heard my story. I shared it with him. He said, Matt, we could really use you to come and testify on the governor's opioid package. And that was a really scary time for me because that was me going public with my story, going before a lot of my former colleagues in the House and the Senate, and just sharing my story. You know, look, I was with you, you know me, this is my story. I fell into addiction. It can happen to anybody. You know, once again, trying to remove that stigma. And I got an incredibly warm reception, incredibly supportive. I remember one state senator that I actually came into the House with back in '94, just walking up and giving me a hug. And that just started opening up all kinds of doors where there was just an opportunity to run for office again. And I made it all about the opioid epidemic.
Yeah, because that's what you talked about in the video.
I did. In that area that I was running for, that district was Western Maryland, which is all part of that Appalachian belt where the opioid epidemic really took off, where it's particularly hit our country hard. And I just found, you know, this was not a partisan issue. This was a life or death issue. This is something everybody could rally behind. And it just gave me a great platform to talk about the opioid epidemic as a recovering addict, as somebody who was in the state legislature. And it gave me the opportunity to share my story on a very wide basis. And that led to the governor basically inviting me to work in his administration on some really important issues, you know, in the addiction recovery field. So I actually withdrew to do that. So because once again, it was never about me being back in public office. It was about the message. And I was able to do that, and once again, just in working that community, it ended up going to work for a nonprofit of a gentleman up in Maryland who had started a national nonprofit, but was very committed to bringing solutions, and saying really going after what is the root cause of addiction, how do we prevent this, how do we really treat it, and I don't mean just the front end treatment side, but how do we do these things we've been talking about, how do we bring into place these things that people need to ensure that transition from treatment to long-term stable recovery.
Right. So what brought you down to Florida? When did you come to Florida?
There's a couple reasons, but a lot of the work we started to do, Florida, especially, Palm Beach here, this is ground zero for addiction recovery. And a lot of it was as we were expanding our nonprofit, for me to be in a place where I could end up meeting folks like you, like John Hewlick, like people who are really doing the innovative things. Because one of the things I've seen nationwide, by and large, is that a lot of state and local governments are still doing the same old things, but they're expecting different results. And in recovery, we call that insanity.
I think we do in non-recovery world too.
Yeah, exactly. We just keep doing the same things over again. And and here in Palm Beach, and like you mentioned, State's Attorney Ehrenberg, the things he was doing, the things that were going on, both public and private, were really cutting edge. The things John Hewlick was doing, and I'm looking around the country saying, I don't see this anywhere else, and this is actually working. So that excited me, and I felt I needed to be in this environment, that it allowed me the freedom and the ability to build something out here for the nonprofit, which it has.
So the nonprofit that you sort of work for in Maryland, is that who you're working for now?
I am. It's called Give America Hope. And Give America Hope is specifically engaged in real evidence-based, solutions-driven work that's providing. Here's the exciting part, really bringing the tools and technology that we need so that governments, institutions, and people can make the right decisions, that we can identify the factors, the key components of what causes addiction, so we can work on the preventative side. The old saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. But also on this huge issue, which I think people are slowly waking up to, is, treatment's not enough. That really is just the first step. How do we transition from treatment to long-term stable recovery? What do we need to be doing for people? How can governments allocate their resources into the things that work? We talk about housing and employment, even transportation. How do we bring even these subjective things into the picture where we make sure that people are in the environment that they need to have a healthy, long-term stable recovery?
Yeah, it's interesting. My partner Audra and I, we went to an event for NAMI last night.
Right.
And it was really more of a symposium based on dealing with mental illness and stuff. And we had a judge there who runs the mental health court down in Broward, and they had a sergeant from the Broward Sheriff's Office. And one of the complaints that was coming from the audience was just the lack of resources. And
right.
Audra does the guardianship work, and that is primarily where we have really significant mental illness. And it seems like the mental illness component, I know that sometimes that goes together with substance use disorder.
Right.
It seems like resources for specifically that are even more limited than, say, somebody who has a substance use disorder.
That's so true.
And
that's so true. It's true. And a lot of these times, once again, my own personal experience, and the data bears this out, is, we're dealing with a lot of, as they call them, co-occurring disorders. There's a lot of folks with undiagnosed mental conditions who have been self-medicating for years. This comprehensive approach to addressing mental health conditions and substance abuse is critical. Making sure that all of those are funded. So I think realizing too, even with me and my story, is that I had to deal with some underlying, anxiety and depression issues that I really had tried to deal with, but I used substances to correct illegal and illicit substances. So we do need to do that. Absolutely.
So where do you see things going from here? We're in the middle of a sort of a national epidemic that is literally wiping out a whole generation of young people.
It is.
Where do we go from here?
I like, in a lot of times at work, I like to use analogies, or like to compare it to something to give people almost like a baseline to work from. In many respects, and not completely, but so I say this cautiously, but importantly, in a lot of respects, there's some similarities between what we're seeing now in the AIDS epidemic of the 80s, and I'm looking at this just from a public health standpoint. Where the first order of mostly state and local governments, because they're on the front lines, has been let's stop the dying. That's the first concern. Which of course we see Narcan, we see trying to get people into treatment, trying to direct folks away from their addiction, but we continue to see this ongoing, where it seems that everything we throw at it hasn't really helped the issue. I think we're going to need to once again really focus on like I said, this transition of once we get people stable, we need to get them into an environment where long-term stable recovery is possible. And there's some really important factors and key components that we really haven't been concentrating on that we need to start shifting more resources to, both public and private. So I think that what we need to do is, I mean, folks like you and me, honestly, we need to provide, as I call it, the thought leadership on this, because there does need to be a shift. There does need to be that paradigm shift, that transition from, okay, we've stabilized the patient, the person. You know, what do we need to do to transition them into this? What things do we need to, what infrastructure do we need to build back into their lives to ensure that stable recovery?
Right. And I know, you know, when I was a young prosecutor back in the 90s,
Right.
and you know, they were every, you know, cycle they were cutting back the state attorney's
Right.
budget. You know, we went from having 2 secretaries and a support person to 2 secretaries, and
Right.
and I'm, you know, and it sort of has been shrinking ever since. And I'm saying, okay, I mean, we all sort of, we can all contribute to the ideas. There's a lot of great ideas that have been, you know, especially down here at Ground Zero. But at the end of the day, unless, you know, our states have those funds,
Absolutely.
I don't know how we, you know, how do we. This sort of, to me, it's almost like we want the infrastructure, but we don't want so much infrastructure that people get lost in the shuffle, you know?
Well, look, I mean, this is something you can certainly personally understand, and once again, something that I relate this to is, you know, when I was in the legislature, every bill we heard, every piece of legislation came with what we call a fiscal note. You know, that was really what determined, is this thing going to pass or fail? What is the cost tag on this? We were always looking for ways of saying, look, here's an existing cost. How do we reduce that? You know, how do we do things to bring those costs down? And so a lot of this is, you know, I get back the ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. A lot of these times that, you know, in reducing costs and reallocating resources, you know, what are the things that are going to save us money? The analogy I use, I'm sure you can relate to, is the issue, say, in criminal justice of recidivism. You know, if, you know, how much are we spending just to see somebody stay in that cycle of going back and back into prison? You know, and a lot of the work that we focused on, you know, has really come out of the idea around, you know, what were the things that they found in the criminal justice system to reduce recidivism?
Huge.
How much do we save if we can deviate? And think about it in these terms. If we have, and this is what Give America Hope is actively working and developing now, if we have tools and resources that can step in and predict a relapse a month, a week, a few weeks, a few days before it happens, and we can intervene, and we can assist governments, state and local governments, from having things in place where they can intervene before somebody does go back into the high-end cost treatment side of things. How do we develop those? How do we accurately predict those? We feel we can. We feel the research is there. The things we're developing can help governments do that. But that really is that is akin to, you know, once again, having somebody go back into the criminal justice system, you know, and the cost savings there. So there's a huge financial incentive.
You know, it's so interesting you say that, you know, because when I was I was an intern in 1993, so I'm aging myself a bit, and I was between my second and third year of law school. I was full of piss and vinegar, and I was like, yeah, let's put everybody in jail. Right. But then after about 6 months, I was like, you know, I think I've seen that guy before.
Right.
I'm like, what's going on here? Why is he back?
Right.
And I, you know, and once I, you know, was full time as a prosecutor, I realized, you know, a lot of the people who are in this system, not all of them, because you know, look, if somebody commits a heinous crime, rape, robbery, murder, I mean, those people we have to take out of society. But a lot of people who are coming back, who are going, you know, we sort of talk about the revolving door at the emergency room. I've, you know, I said to Dave Ehrenberg, we have a revolving door at the courthouse.
Absolutely.
And, you know, how many of those people who are coming in and out have substance use and mental illness issues? They're not getting treated, and so whatever they need to do to sort of cope, feed their habit, as it were, it's causing them to be rearrested. And we're just going, it's law enforcement, it's, you know, the pressure on the judiciary, the clerk's office, the public defenders.
Absolutely,
I mean, we must be wasting a ton of money. We've got to be.
We are. It's absolutely, Mark, you're right. And I mean, you know, once again, that's what that we're trying to shift, and that's that thought leadership I'm talking about, is how do we start for the decision makers, for the policy makers, you know, for the larger institutions and organizations. You know, the real question, and here's the power of effective questions, you know, are we really asking, why is this happening? What is causing this in the first place? What are the root contributing factors? And once again, you know, very much like any disaster or emergency, you know, so much effort is, let's just stop the dying, let's stop the bleeding, go back. But, you know, and once we do that, now what do we do? You know, how can I take that person who's come into the system, who is relapsed repeatedly, or who's, you know, first-time overdose or whatever, really asking what's going on in their lives? What resources do they have? Why are they continuing to relapse? And getting to the why is really a huge battle. It's really providing that leadership of let's start looking at the factors of what else is going on in this person's life. that is contributing to this in some form, and how much of a contributing factor is that? So these are critical questions, and like you alluded to, and we've said before, and you've heard it. We can't arrest this way out of our problem. We can't. We just can't look at one thing to the exclusion of all other things, and that's where we need to start moving.
So do you think? I know Dave's been active in this, but do you think that the Palm Beach County is going to become sort of the national model? I mean, obviously, one of the things that we've done down here, and I told the task force, I think that was the time you saw me there, right?
Exactly.
Which is, you guys don't realize what you've done. You've actually made it more attractive to come to Florida now than before, because, well, we're cleaning up the industry. And really, there's only 3 places to go, I think, for treatment as a general: Florida, Texas, or California.
Right. There's
sprinklings everywhere else. But I get calls from the Midwest. People say, we have no treatment centers up here.
Yeah.
We have one, and it sucks. It's terrible.
Right.
We're sending our kid to Florida. So, I mean, maybe it's an opportunity for Florida, to be that model, not just for treatment, but for how to sort of legislatively put all the pieces together.
I think it is. I think you're absolutely right, Mark. And once again, believe it or not, I think the issue is as simple as this in one word: leadership. I think we really do have great leadership here in Palm Beach County. State's Attorney Ehrenberg, amazing job he's doing. John Hulick. There are other folks on the County Commissioner Board who are really demonstrating the kind of leadership we need.
Melissa McKinley, phenomenal.
McKinley's phenomenal. I was going to mention her too. And once again, I'm constantly looking at states and localities across the country. What are they doing different? Where's their leadership? And there is a huge vacuum. And I hate to say this to sound cynical or crass, but it's almost as if a lot of folks in leadership, especially in political leadership, just want to say, let's just try to solve the death problem of overdoses and get this off our plate and move on. And I think it's a very cynical and short-term approach.
Yeah, I don't think this is a football you can punt down the street and
no, it's not. It's not.
Wait.
But it's different here in Palm Beach, and that's what excites me, is that we have a space down here to operate where we really can say, let's think through this, let's do new and innovative things. Let's put aside the bureaucracy, because let's save lives. And so I do see that in Palm Beach, and that's the exciting thing, and that's certainly allowed me to do a lot of work down here.
Wow.
Yeah, absolutely.
So for folks that are watching the show, how do they find out more about you and what you're doing and the not-for-profit?
You can go to the website, giveamericahope.org, to spell it all out. You can email me. We have a Facebook, Give America Hope Facebook, you can follow us on. And the exciting thing, too, is we really are, something John Hulick said, with a lot of the work we're doing, there's 2 sides of this which are exciting. We're in the infancy, which is exciting, and we're also on the cusp of, I think, really having a breakthrough. So the resources we need to do that, the support, the help, the network we need to build, that's all vital in these early stages.
Yeah. So listen, I really appreciate you coming on the show. And for the folks who are watching, don't forget to, I remember this stuff, Jay, to like and subscribe our YouTube channel. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and also on LinkedIn. So you've got the Mark Astor page, the Drug and Alcohol Attorneys page. You can find us on the web, drugandalcoholattorneys.com. You can email me, mark@drugandalcoholattorneys.com. And you can call us, 561-419-6095. Until the next episode, thanks for tuning in.